All right, let's dive into a hugely influential and, fiercely debated idea that has totally reshaped the conversation around the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. We're talking about the work of Ilan Pappé. So here's how we're going to tackle this. First, we'll look at the history that set the stage. Then we'll get right into the core argument, that explosive ethnic cleansing thesis. After that, we'll unpack the intense criticism and then see how this all had a massive impact, not just in books, but in the real world. Okay, so you have to go back to the 1980s. This is when Israel started opening up its state archives from its founding period. A group of Israeli academics got their hands on these documents, and what they found? Well, it created a genuine earthquake in how Israel understood its own history. And this really lays out the two competing stories. On one side, you have the traditional narrative that many Israelis grew up with, that Palestinians left on their own, that Arab leaders told them to go, and that it was a David versus Goliath war. But then, on the other side, you have what these new historians, guys like Betty Morris and Avi Schleim, said the archives actually revealed. Schleim, for instance, even found evidence of a secret understanding between Jordan and Israel to basically carve up Palestinian territory between them. A very different picture. But here's the thing. While the other new historians were busy challenging specific pieces of the official story, Ilan Pappé wasn't just chipping away at the edges. He was trying to build a case to completely rewrite the very nature of the 1948 war itself. So what is this argument? What did he say that made him one of the most polarizing figures in this whole field? Well, it all comes down to a term he chose very, very carefully. Right, so in his huge 2006 book, The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine, Pappe argues that what happened to the Palestinians wasn't just some tragic, unfortunate side effect of a war. No, he contends it was a deliberate, planned policy that perfectly fits the modern definition of ethnic cleansing. And the absolute heart of Pappe's argument is that this was all premeditated. He points to a military document called Plan D as the master blueprint for it all. And, crucially, he claims this wasn't just about the war in 1948. He sees it as a continuous process, something that didn't just stop when the fighting ended. And the sheer scale of this is a central pillar of his whole argument. I mean, we're talking about a number that he says represents nearly 80% of the entire Palestinian population in the area that became Israel, forced from their homes. And it wasn't just about moving people. Pappe's research points to the systematic erasure of a physical presence from the land itself, with over 500 villages, he says, just completely wiped off the map. Now, as you can probably imagine, when you make an argument that explosive, it's not going to go unchallenged. The backlash from other academics, including some of the people he used to work with, was swift, it was severe, and it got very personal. And what's so fascinating is that the most cutting criticism actually came from inside the new historian camp. Benny Morris, who himself had documented forced expulsions, basically accused Pappe of twisting the evidence, of exaggerating what he found, and of being driven more by a political agenda than by the actual historical facts. And it wasn't just his former colleagues. Other critics, like David Price-Jones and Seth Fransman, argue that his whole thesis is just fundamentally flawed because it rips the events out of their historical context. Their point is that he ignores the incredible trauma of the Holocaust, which had just happened, and the existential threat that the new Jewish state was facing, losing 1% of its population in that war. So if you boil it all down, this is the back and forth. The critics accuse him of bad scholarship and political bias. And his defense? He says, look, I acknowledge the Jewish trauma, but you can't use that to justify or erase what happened to the Palestinians. And when they say he's political, he fires back that yes, he is, because historians have a moral duty to challenge national myths, to maybe, just maybe, open up a path to peace. And this is so important. This whole fiery debate didn't just stay locked up in academic journals. Pappe's ideas started to spread. His own role began to shift, and his work ended up having a huge effect way beyond the university. This timeline really shows you his whole journey. You can see how his time at Oxford, where he was mentored by Arab scholars like Albert al-Rani, really shaped him. Then came the 90s and the Oslo Accords, which cracked open a space in Israel for what was called post-Zionism, this critical look at the country's founding ideas. It all led up to that bombshell 2006 book and, not long after, his departure from his job at Haifa University. And here's where it gets really interesting. Despite all the academic controversy, or maybe because of it, Pappe's ideas really took off outside of mainstream Israeli circles. Top Palestinian scholars embraced them. The theory became a cornerstone for a whole new academic field called settler colonial studies. And it gave activists and human rights groups a powerful new vocabulary to describe the conflict. So where does all this lead? Well, for Pappe, his version of history doesn't just rewrite the past. He believes it points directly to a very specific and pretty radical idea of what the future should look like. He completely rejects the two-state solution, the idea that's been on the table for decades. He basically calls it a sham, a smokescreen that lets Israel continue its policies. Instead, he pushes for what's known as the one-state solution, a single, secular, democratic country for both Jews and Palestinians, with equal rights for everyone. And this vision requires what he calls decolonization, and addressing the right of return for refugees. At the end of the day, why are we still talking about this? Well, the answer is all about the incredible power of history. How we choose to understand the past directly shapes what we do today and what we even think is possible for tomorrow. And this quote from Pappe himself really gets to the heart of his whole mission. He's arguing that facing up to history, no matter how painful or how much people disagree about it, is the only real way to build a different kind of future. Now, whether you agree with him or you reject everything he says, his work forces everyone to confront the past. And it leaves us all to think about the incredible weight and the incredible responsibility of historical truth.